lovelies. Today we're looking at Dames of Asstoria, which is essentially Monstergirl the RPG, I suppose. I was sent this hard copy to review, so that's disclosed. And I also, I guess, have the reputation as the sexy role-playing guy. For one reason or another, so that might be biasing me a little bit as well. So that's all the disclosure out of the way. This is the core rulebook. It is by Dead Tree Studios. It was kickstarted and obviously was successful because there's a game here. So let's get into it. Now, Monster Girls have been popular online for quite some time, for largely obvious reasons, I would say. Let me just turn off this extra light. Okay, so I think a lot of people have thought about tapping in to that whole Monster Girl encyclopedia sort of strain that runs through various fandoms. Kukurio does Monster Girls on Tour, which is quite popular, very nice art. And so this is an example, I think, of people trying to tap into that very scaly, chitinous, sexy monster sort of trope in a lot of ways. And I personally don't see anything wrong with that whatsoever. That's fine. If that's what you're into, it's all good with me. That's that's fine. But what we have here is a little bit peculiar if you think about the whole thing as being an attempt to tap into that whole genre. Because what we have here is, despite, ass being in the name, we have a fully fledged game with a fully fledged background and surprisingly little in the way of sexy shenanigans or even talking about that side of the game world and everything in it. So as you can see, they have a fully realised map. They go into a great deal of detail quite early on about the history and the various kingdoms and powers and everything else within the world. And it's all quite well realised and thought out. There's lots of interesting hooks and everything. It's all front-loaded, the information about the world, which is a bit of an odd choice. Goes against what most people consider orthodoxy in game design. Usually you want to kind of excite people by presenting the characters and start with character creation, and then you fill in the details later on, but they seem to have gone against that. I don't think there's much to talk about either way when it comes to that. They're both valid approaches. But perhaps for a game like this, this might have been a mistake, front-loading all of this overwhelming lore and information. But yes, you have an imperialistic and not particularly nice human kingdom, and you have various other fringe states, some run by humans, which are less oppressive in one way or another. And you have areas run over by the demi-fauna, which are the half-breed creatures, the humanoid animal crossbreeds across this world. In the past, there have been a couple of big shaping conflicts. One was a big fight against mimics and slimes, and the other was a big fight to unthrone the god of the world, or the primary god of the world. And that god cursed all the demi-fauna, demi-human peoples by making it so that they could no longer bear sons. And this has been going on for generations. So every demi-human is a woman. With the possible exception of turtle men, perhaps, something very, very long-lived. But even then, they can't bear sons. Now this bears the question, where do new demi-fauna come from? And the answer is obvious in that they have to crossbreed with humans in order to produce any offspring at all. Unless perhaps they come from a species that can change gender, like certain fish, frogs, and other things. But we don't go into any of that detail here. Despite the expansive background, there is no mention of the sexual necessities and so on. We're left to come up with that outside the information in the book. Humans are inherently weaker in most ways than any of the demi-fauna, all of which tend to have higher statistics and have access to special abilities based on their monster parts, and better access to magic and so on. Humans' advantage seems to be numbers, acceptability in society, the ability to move freely between the different kingdoms and areas, and of course access to all that sweet, sweet monster pussy. But again, that's not actually made explicit or detailed in this. You're left to infer it from the setting. It's a bit of an odd choice, but perhaps it might lead to harem-style play, where one person plays a slightly hapless human and everyone else plays his Monstergirl entourage. I think that would be a good way to play it. System-wise, this is a bit of a schizophrenic system. You get statistics, which typically range between 1 and 10. You get skills that typically range between 1 and 10. Your various monster or animal traits can alter that. Skills give you access to additional abilities that do things in different ways, or access to different options during combat, all of that sort of thing. A class equivalent called a discipline has a similar effect, and there are talents which also give you different effects. So you have this multi-layered set of options and exceptions on top of your basic statistics. So mostly it's about expanded options. It can feel a little bit complicated, and juggling what options you can take during combat might require a bit of effort, but it's certainly doable. What is confusing is that there are 2 different dice systems for use during play. Outside of combat, you're rolling a dice pool of d10s against a target number and a target number of successes. So kind of like early storyteller games, where different difficulties and different numbers of successes were required to do things. But then in combat, weirdly, it switches to a D100 system that otherwise operates as if you were trying to defeat armor class. I think it's called dodge class in this, but on a scale of 1 to 100. And prior to the review, I just spent quite a long time looking through the book, trying to uncover how combat skills influence your to-hit roll, and that information seems to be entirely absent, which makes me think that it doesn't. It just gives you access to additional options, which feels a little odd, that you can be trained really well in the sword, but have just as good or bad a chance to hit as someone who's never picked one up before. You just won't necessarily have access to the additional moves and so on. And with dodge classes starting around the 20s typically, you're going to be hitting 80% of the time, which puts a lot more emphasis onto armor and various other protective abilities than otherwise might be the case. For a funny game about playing Monster Girls, it is quite complicated. There's a lot of systems. There's a lot of exceptions to systems. There's a lot of detail on wounds and all of these other things, when it probably should be a lot simpler than it actually is. I mean, I would have used the dice pool system for the whole game rather than changing things over, but they've decided to go a different way. One thing I really do like is the customization system, reminiscent of TMNT's bioenergy system. For each set of body parts, head, body, arms, legs, you get to choose a bunch of options, spending points to invoke those, and you should spend them all, because you don't get to respend the leftovers on anything. That's a little weird because it makes it so that you should probably try to spend the maximum number of points possible, which may mean you're not modelling the monstrous or animal species that you're trying to necessarily. You're min-maxing. So I would have thought there would be a better way to do that. You could be more generous with the way in which you allow people to spend points, allowing the leftovers to be put into the miscellaneous traits. But that could lead to some seriously unbalanced characters with ridiculously high statistics. So maybe not. But it just leads to some odd choices when you're creating your characters. I created a mantis person, for example, and there were quite a few leftover points, or I found myself buying things at higher rank to use up the point allowance, or as close as I could there too. So yeah, it's just a little bit odd, and it leads to some weird over-optimized or suboptimal decisions while creating a character. Yeah. Another thing I did like was, well, throughout this you've seen the little illustrations of the creatures. So pretty much every monster species is either a mimic, a slime, or a chimera. A mix of different animals from the real world put together, like some kind of flying rat caterpillar thing, I guess. And that's done for all of the monsters. I didn't really delve into the magic system too much because that's always the most complicated thing in any game, it seems like. But basically you seem to have magic points and action points. It takes a certain number of actions and a certain number of magic points to cast the spells, and then you need to regain those over time. So not too difficult, and a lot more freewheeling, a lot more intuitive than, say, Dungeons and Dragons sort of way of going about things. So, I mean, that's pretty much everything covered. So we can start talking about it overall. Presentation-wise, it's basic, but there's nothing wrong with basic presentation of games. It does make it clear and easy to read. The artwork is nice, perfectly competent. You would want kind of cutesy anime style art for this sort of game, and it has it, and it works very well. Some of the options are a little odd. I mean, looking at equipment and so on, it's all on these little like card layouts, but they're not actually card layouts. But that might make it a good way to print out and then cut out the various bits of equipment that you have. And you could also do that for your skills and special abilities and so on, and that might make it easier to reference during play. Okay, I'm going to do these actions with this weapon. So that might be an interesting way to play, having like a little deck of cards with your character sheet. Of course, you'll probably lose them, but that's an option. We've got nice illustrations for most of the equipment, including the armor, so you can see how it goes together. And we of course have the classic chainmail bikini. You wouldn't expect anything different from a game like this. Yeah, the artwork's good. The layout's basic but clear. Weirdly, I find that these things tend to blend together visually, which actually makes it a bit more difficult to look things up than a standard equipment list might be, where you can just track down. But it's an interesting choice. It's a different choice. I'm just not entirely sure that it works visually any better than a list. But yeah, it's a choice. Yeah, like I say, there's some weird choices here. The system is quite complicated. The formulae for just hit points and things are laid out in lines with lots of brackets and things, which can be visually a little bit confusing, especially if you're not that familiar with mathematics. And using the star for the multiplier instead of the times symbol, just for some people, I can see how that would be a bit confusing. There's a lot of subsystems for magic and for combat, and lots of exceptions and so on, so that builds complexity into it. The index isn't very good. That's a problem. The contents is better, but I can't pick people up too much on that, because making an index is always the most annoying part of the process. I find it's laborious and tedious, and the automatic index makers never work right. So, conclusions then. Just lastly, here's the bestiary. You can see how these are all mingled traits. Okay, so I was interrupted by inexplicable loud noises and having a coughing fit, but I'm back now. Yeah, so, final thoughts. Okay, I really wanted to like this, and wanted to like it more than I actually do. There's a lot of good stuff about it, but I'm going to say something that I almost never say. This would have been better off as either a 5th edition compatible book or as an OSR compatible book. I like the creature creation, the personal sort of demifauna creation, and that they've gone with making it open rather than just having set races. It's reminiscent of my own machinations of the Space Princess, or as I mentioned, the TMNT bioenergy system. That's great. This is a throwback in a lot of ways. Having different systems for different things is, it takes us all the way back to AD&D, really. I'm not sure that works. I'm not sure I understand the combat system. It feels like something's missing. And it's complicated. With the different layering of effects and choices and so on. It's a bit of a Frankenstein system with bits and pieces everywhere. Also, for me, despite the name, it didn't feel like it really went for it. It felt like it was holding back by not getting into the sexy time stuff and the implications of that for the world. It felt coy, too coy, and the artwork wasn't necessarily as attuned to that marketplace as it might necessarily be. It's cute, it's kind of sexy, but I'm not saying there should have been anything full frontal or whatever in here, not that would have hurt, but it just, again, it felt a bit coy. So, scores. In terms of style, I think the artwork's good. It's a simplistic layout, but there's nothing necessarily wrong with that. The background information is a bit dry, and it's front-loaded, and it doesn't go into the things you would expect it to go into. But all things considered, I would say a low 4 out of 5 for style. In terms of substance, there's a lot here, but not the kind of stuff that you're necessarily expecting to get. There are gaps, and aspects of it aren't particularly well explained. I think a second edition could really fix a lot of issues with this. I don't know how they're going to support it, whether they're going to support it, but honestly, I think it needs another pass. The editing was also a little bit absent. Reading through the book, I don't say these things to be mean. I say them out of love and out of the desire for a better product. So I can't score it higher than a low 3, or probably a high 2 in terms of substance. We'll call it the 3 to be generous. So that's 7 out of 10, 3.5 out of 5, slightly above average, mostly in terms of potential and what you at home could do with the game rather than what is presented here. And again, I say that out of love and out of the desire for a better product from a promising indie studio. The only last thing I would say is I think this was printed through drive-thrus printers who I think are Ingram, which used to be Lightning Source, I think. Yeah, Ingram, Milton Keynes. Their colour printing is not the best, especially if your game is quite colourful like this. I don't know if you can tell through the camera, but this is always my complaint, isn't it? But in this case, I think it's not down to the artist, and it's not down to the art choices. It's down to the printer, all right? So if you've got PDF, that's not going to bother you, but it's really flat. There's a lack of colour depth. The blacks and dark colours aren't truly dark. The lights aren't truly light, and everything becomes a bit of a wash. Lulu's colour printing, even at the lower cost level for their colour printing, is better. So honestly, I cannot recommend drive-through's print-on-demand process, because it results in inferior quality product, especially if we're talking colour product. So I think you're better off using Lulu or someone else if you can find them for doing colour printing, especially if you can afford the higher level print quality, or take the cut on profits. Black and white, it's fine, but for colour, it just doesn't look good. The binding otherwise is nice, hardback, but don't use them for colour printing. It's just not up to snuff, and never has been. All right, Zang.
Postcards from Evaladad is a darkly surreal tech noir game set in an adventure context for splatpunk and actual fucking monsters, or indeed any system you care to use. Evaladad combines cyber, bio, sci and narco-punk to create a Barosian nightmare world of decadence, drugs, libertarianism, violence, glamour and oppression. You will delve into the strange lives of Evaladad celebrities, fiscal royalty and the seedy underbelly in this unique game setting. Available at post-mort.com, lulu.com and DriveThruRPG.
Monster misbehaving, planets needing saving, situations graven, I'll form the head. The enemy is clever, we're smaller but whatever. When we put it together, I'll form the head. Y'all can do the treading, swing energy machete. If combination's ready, I'll form the head. I'll form the head. I'll form the head.